Well, everybody, welcome to day 2 of Student Scholar Days. And my name is Rich Loosbrock, and this next presentation is by Kelly Hosner Crowley. She actually developed this as a paper in my class last semester, History in the Age of U.S. in the Age of World Wars, 1920 to 1945. One of the rewarding things as faculty here at Adams State is getting to see our students do this, seeing our students doing original research and then getting to present it. So I'm actually very pleased to have her today. This is actually almost could be subtitled Taking Comic Books Seriously. The subject really is popular culture here, and I think that we have a tendency to see popular culture as nothing more than something that they just do at that particular moment, but it always has deeper meaning. It's always informed by deeper meanings. And that's what she's going to present on today. So without further ado, Kelly Hosner Crowley.
Thank you, Dr. Loosbrock, for your kind support in putting together this presentation. Also, thanks to all of you for coming today and supporting Student Scholar Days at Adams State. I'm Kelly Hosner Crowley, and my presentation is entitled How Boys and Girls Can Help Win the War, Comic Books in World War II and Beyond. Captain America burst onto newsstands in March 1941. Donning his classic flag-emulating costume, Cap will be pictured slugging a uniformed Adolf Hitler square in the face. This cover will be dated 7 months before the attacks at Pearl Harbor. Now, during the class of Dr. Loosbrock's American History, for which the paper that this presentation is based on was written, he made one point very clear. Everything changed in American history with World War II. Now, comic books are an amazing medium through which to see this change. For one thing, we've got tons of primary sources that are accessible to all ages. Also, there's a lot of scholarship behind it. What I hope to do today is to kind of synthesize all the origin stories for these comic book heroes and put them in their place, in their time, World War II, in a way that is relatable to a really wide audience. The fact that we get a character like Captain America during the lead up to World War II is no coincidence. He so much embodies the New Deal, do the right thing, American dream values that will emerge with the war. That we see the elevation of Wonder Woman and the immigrant Superman during this time is also not a coincidence. They very much represent how people are framing their participation in the war effort. It's also a great reflection of how that participation is being framed for them. Comic books are an art form created by actual people, but they're also a really potent vehicle for propaganda. As military historian Cord Scott puts it, comics often conceal secret gems of historical import. They directly reflect their audience's fantasies, nightmares, and delusions. Beginning with alter ego, Steve Rogers, Captain America's origin story portrays Rogers as a scrawny 97-pound weakling who tries to join up with the army, but is turned away. Along comes a mad U.S. government scientist who dreams of creating super agents for the war efforts. He injects the young Rogers, who would do anything to help the cause, with a serum, and he becomes super powerful. He, like most superheroes, will live a double life, existing by day as Private First Class Steve Rogers and transforming into Captain America wherever there are vicious elements who seek to overthrow the U.S. government. Now, in the years 1939, which is when Germany invades Poland and the bombings at Pearl Harbor, public opinion is being raised in the United States. The military is being raised in the United States in anticipation that we might have to either defend ourselves or get involved in the war. Now, this is completely reflected in Captain America's origin story, right? He joins the military, building up the military. He is punching out Adolf Hitler, raising up public opinion. Now, to further explore how this involvement, this pre-involvement propaganda was being built up and the motivation behind it, we turn to the Man of Steel, Superman. Superman was the brainchild of two Cincinnati teenagers, Jerry Siegel and Joel Shuster. Now, let's try to recreate Superman's origin story. I remember those late 70s films with Christopher Reeve as Superman. His home planet is exploding, right? His parents pack him up in a little tiny baby transport pod and tearfully send him off the planet as it's exploding. He falls to Earth, lands in a Kansas cornfield where he's picked up and adopted by a kindly farming couple. He'll have to hide his superpower behind the facade of Clark Kent. Well, creators Joel Siegel and Joe Shuster would know a little bit what that immigrant experience that they put Superman through. They'll a little bit know what that immigrant experience was like. Born Jerome Shusterwitz, son of Canadian Czechoslovakian Jewish immigrants, and Jerry Siegel, son of Lithuanian Jews, their parents would arrive in the United States just before the Great Depression. They probably wouldn't have spoken very much English. They would largely remain unassimilated. They probably would face some discriminations in 1920s Cincinnati. But their children, these guys, would be born in the United States. They would speak English. They would read comic books. And they would largely see American culture as theirs to freely participate in and to create. Jack Kirby, born Jakob Kurzberg, and Joe Simon, born Jaime Simon, are the creators of Captain America. Up here we see Stan Lee, probably the most famous comic book creator of this generation. He died last year. He was born Stanley Martin Lieber, a Romanian Jewish immigrant. We'll talk about him later. He was in the armed services during World War II. It seems like the real-life Axis powers knew about the Jewish Superman. German propagandist Joseph Goebbels gave a speech saying Superman epitomized all that was wrong with American society. Now, a lot of the scholars that I've read thought that the point of active advocacy on the part of these Jewish artists to get the U.S. into the war was kind of obvious. It was overt. They were Jews. They had heard about what was happening in Europe. They were going to use their art form to kind of build up public opinion. Now, after reading the actual stories of these creators, I kind of would argue that this has a few more complexities than can be offered here. Sure, they had an artistic vision to create good guys to counter the bad guys, but the irony of self-conscious Jews in an already anti-Semitic environment creating heroes with stereotypical Aryan features is more of a reflection of what Cord Scott said earlier. Comics being the delusions, fantasies, and nightmares of their audiences, but also their creators. It's just one of many hypocrisies and ambiguities that you can find in the 1940s comic book. Blacks, Africans, Asians will all often be portrayed in demeaning ways, often under the auspices of doing what is right. Here we have Dr. Psycho. This is Wonder Woman's arch nemesis. He has 4 heads. The Axis evil, or the Axis leaders. Now remember, the Axis powers were the bad guys in World War II. So you've got Benito Mussolini, Adolf Hitler, and General Hirohito. Now one of my sources wrote an analysis called Champions of the Oppressed, ? Superhero comics, popular culture, and propaganda in America during World War II. He says that superhero comics spent a great deal of time visualizing Japanese defeat and humiliation, always in a manner drawing attention to racial and cultural differences and supposed inferiority. The power comic books had to create heroes and villains while at the same time upholding the image of American superiority cannot be underestimated. And a little later now, the year the U.S. officially enters the war, we get Wonder Woman. Comic book historians count 39 superwomen who will precede her, but she will be the first one to have a whole series of issues all to herself. Now, unlike the creators of Captain America and Superman, Wonder Woman was created by a Harvard psychologist. William Moulton Marsden was a strange bird. He, as Harvard historian Jo Lepore will reveal in her very comprehensive and highly readable history about Wonder Woman, he was no ordinary man, and his family was no ordinary family. William Moulton Marsden would live with and raise children with 2 women to whom he was married, Elizabeth Holloway Marsden and Olive Bryne Richard. They both would be uncredited writers on his Wonder Woman comic book. Now, I'm not going to go too much farther into all the unorthodoxies of this family. There's been a Hollywood movie put out recently. It has lots of inaccuracies. Instead, I would encourage you to read this highly readable and very scholarly work by Miss Lepore. Let's just say the Hollywood version of Moulton Marsden is in stark contrast to Lepore's illustration of a man, especially in his later years, roaming the family home in his underwear while his 2 highly intelligent wives take care of the children, pay the bills, and write his comic book for him. Just like Captain America and Superman, the fact that we get Wonder Woman right at World War II is no coincidence. World War II will see several 100,000 women actually in the military. This is unprecedented. 8 million women will enter the workforce during World War II. They will actively participate in public life. This is an amazing milestone of U.S. her story and a great example of what Dr. Lusbrock says. Everything changed in the United States with World War II. Comic books are also created from within the armed services. We were talking about Stan Lee. Stan Lee was an enlisted man. He was stationed stateside in the War Films Department during the war. He worked right alongside another author for children, Theodore Geisel. Dr. Seuss and Stan Lee shared a desk at the War Films Department office during World War II. Now, in his highly readable and super fun comic book memoir, Stan Lee says his most important contribution to the war effort was a series of posters entitled BD, Not Me. For those of you not alive in the 1950s and 60s, BD stands for venereal diseases, which are also known as sexually transmitted diseases. They were a thing during World War II as well. We get the first iteration of G.I. Joe during World War II, and all of the armed services will have internal newspapers and magazines which will feature comic strips. So artists are working in the military to create art like this guy. Bill Modlin will win the Pulitzer Prize in 1945 for creating Willie and Joe. There are a couple of soldiers. Sometimes this work is pretty serious and sometimes it's comedic. Bill Modlin will have a little run-in with General George Patton. He is one of the very famous generals that we'll see in World War II. Patton will bring him into the office after he sees that his comic book characters, Willie and Joe, are being disrespectful to their superiors, saying, "You put them to a lot better use than giving our officers a hard time." Okay, now it's hard to get an exact number of how many people were reading comic books during this era, but this is how we begin to figure it out. Publishers Weekly and Business Watch will say that in 1942, 15 million copies of comic books will be sold. They raised that number to 25 million in 1943. The Justice Society does a survey where 20% of the respondents are girls. So we know 20% of girls, 25 million copies. Now, the U.S. Postal Service estimates that 30% of bulk material mailed over to military overseas, 30% were comic books. So, put that all together, we've got 25 million comic books sold to boys, girls, people on the home fronts, a whole lot of GIs. But imagine this. We'll never know how many people were actually reading them because one comic book could be passed around an entire platoon or an entire neighborhood of children. The financial impact of comic books were having during this time was reflective of the fact that their parents, the kids' parents, were being employed in war activities, the booming economy. So they finally had spending money for one of the first times. Because of this, comic books, a media expert says that during this period, if the government wanted to get the word to kids about collecting scrap, saving rubber, or collecting war bonds, they went to the men that owned Superman. Another fun fact, paper rationing was definitely happening during this era as material austerities. However, comic books kind of dodged this because one reason, perhaps their mafia connections got them paper that others couldn't, or because they were so popular with GI. Now, after the war, folks needed to get back to work. They couldn't just sit around reading comic books all day. So this leads to a lull in comic book sales after the war. However, with the Cold War, we'll see a rise again with the same old comic book heroes like Captain America, Commie Smasher. 3 of the commentators that I have cited here all bring direct correlation between the popularity of comic books and U.S. involvement in overseas wars. Now, this begs kind of a concluding question. How come we are seeing so much comic book driven media today? In order to take the thread from the way back and pull it up into the future, I turn to contemporary author Ta-Nehisi Coates, author of our Adams State Community Read Between the World. Coates, I was fascinated, flabbergasted to find in my research, is the most recent author for Captain America. During World War II, heroes fought for what was right. They supposedly helped the underdog. In 1966, we'll see Black Panther come onto the scene. Coates also writes for him. The same exact year that the American political party of the same name is founded. In the 1980s and 90s, when the United States sees a rise in crime, the Punisher, Batman, with their vigilante justice will reign. The current enemy of Captain America is the power elite. During World War II, Captain America was created to punch out Adolf Hitler. Today, he still remains to fight the battles some Americans feel still need fighting. Thank you. Thank you for listening. Now I would love to hear your input and take any questions that you'd like to ask if you are willing.
So I know that your research did focus on World War II. However, like we did have that Captain America issue like 2-ish years ago, where Cap was with Hydra. What are your thoughts on that side of it?
Okay, when he was with Hydra, I think it's very so these ones are great. I had not read Captain America. These new ones are really amazing, written by Mr. Coates, and I think they're really readable, and they don't have quite the ambiguities and hypocrisies that we've seen before. He's very sensitive to these sort of things when he writes, which I think makes it more accessible and readable for somebody like me. But this idea that he goes to Hydra, which is kind of like he gets kidnapped by the bad side, basically, and he kind of serves them. Is that correct?
I don't remember much of that comic line, but to my understanding of it, he actually willingly joined them. And I know Marvel did release a statement about that comic,
Yeah.
like that specific issue, and has redacted some of their statements about it. However, like they did still release that, and that did hurt a lot of like their Jewish community.
Yeah. So, Coates really is creating Captain America in a way that he can be seen as a bad guy, and I see this reflective in Coates' other work, that to position our hero on the wrong side of things is a very dynamic thing that media can do, because it brings in inclusivity. So that's the way I see that, and I did read a little bit about how he kind of, the bad thing. And so sometimes we have to put our, good guys on the bad side in order to see what we think about the bad side, open up our perspective a little bit. Thanks for asking that question. Anybody else? Yeah.
So I have a colleague who works on comic books in Franco, Spain. And so bringing in comic books from the United States is seen as potentially subversive, right? Have you looked at all internationally how these ideas of freedom, justice, the American way are received even beyond the United States?
No, I didn't look into that. Yeah. I've looked at from different perspectives of minorities in the United States, and like underrepresented, people who are not represented in them. But I would imagine that, especially that idea of American superiority always being pushed in these comic books, especially Captain America. Superman, he's kind of universal. Wonder Woman, she might break some boundaries. She's actually from an island, out in the Mediterranean. But no, I don't know how other people outside of the United States view this sort of media. Maybe you would have both, a little emulating, a little seeing it as threatening, and seeing it as propaganda. Yeah. Thanks for asking. I think I can do one more question, yeah?
So what do you think the popularity with the films, like nowadays? Do you think it's like terrorism, or the end of a war, or the war, or why do you think the popularity is back so with film?
This is just a guess.
Yeah, this.
Because as I said, I kind of decided to bring this forward and ask that question, why are they so popular, like you said? Nationalism, a rise in populist movements, a rise in this looking back to the time that was maybe made up in our minds a lot, but this time that was somehow better, somehow more wholesome, somehow. And this is when we turn back to. Mostly because we get most of our pop culture is so created during this time and carries forward. So that's my theory about that, a renewed nationalism and trying to look back at what we are in order to self-define ourselves. Thanks for asking. And thank you guys all for coming.